Welcome to the OMG Tarot podcast. I'm your host, Lindsay, aka OMG Tarot. As I promised in the most recent episode, we're going to do things a little bit differently today. Today, we're not doing a deep dive into a major arcana card, but instead shifting our attention over to members of the court cards. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the knights. Why the knights, you might ask? Because a few episodes ago, in the death episode, we uncovered that the skeleton who's riding the pale horse in the middle of the card is dressed like a knight, and I asked you all to weigh in on it. Is the figure on death a knight? Could it be the remains of a knight? And you guys had some good answers. I threw it up on Instagram, as well as putting a poll on Spotify, and I got some good, varied answers, most of which pointed to yes, death is a knight, which is interesting because I never thought of it that way. But there is some undeniable evidence. Death is dressed like a knight and riding a horse, and to be a little bit more specific, he looks an awful lot like the Knight of Cups, doesn't he? They're both on a very light-colored horse, and in both cases, the horse is moving at a slow pace. Just to add on a little bit to that too, Death is associated with Scorpio, a water sign, and this relates to the Knight of Cups because he's associated with the element of water. So, is Death the dead Knight of Cups? Maybe. And as I've mentioned before, I think those maybes are part of what makes tarot so alluring. There are very few definite answers in the deck, and a lot of it is based on, well, what are you interpreting? When you look at the cards, what do you see? I think learning the cards' textbook definitions and sussing out the different symbols in each card can be very helpful, because I think understanding those gives you a vocabulary that you'll then use to interpret the cards as you pull them up. I think this can actually make your intuitive interpretation of the cards stronger. I don't think using definitions and understanding what the artist meant when including different symbols in each card in any way undermines you being an interpretive reader. That said, you also don't want to rely on textbook definitions when you're interpreting the cards, because if you're just looking them up, you're not interpreting the cards, you're just laying them out and looking at what each one means. So I think that when you're learning tarot, the goal should be to get to interpreting the cards without help from the little white book, and in order to get there, you're probably going to want to at least understand the different suits and the different elements, and even going beyond that, how things like color choices and the choice to include different weather patterns in cards, like I'm looking at the Three of Swords right now, we've got a cloudy sky and heavy dark clouds and a bunch of rain. How all of those pieces of information get visually embedded into the card to communicate to you what that card means. Then the interpretation part is, if you've drawn more than one card, making a story out of the 2 or more cards you've pulled, and also understanding what is the message that I'm interpreting from this based on the question I've asked or what I've sought out to understand. Because you can pull the Three of Swords in a reading about your career, or you can pull it in a reading about whether you should go grocery shopping today. And while there's going to be some overlap between those messages, how it applies to what you're asking about is a big part of interpreting the cards versus just defining them. So maybe when you pull the Death card, you immediately associate it with the Knights. Maybe in your mind, you can't divorce the Death from the Knights. Maybe Death is inherently a knight for you, and that holds some meaning. Or maybe not. Perhaps you're not quite sure where Death falls in with the Knights, and maybe after this episode and learning a bit more about the Knights, you'll have a better grip on how Death fits in with them, if Death fits in with them. So let's dive into the Knights. In your tarot deck, there are 4 knights. There is 1 knight for each of the 4 suits in the minor arcana. Those suits, in our Rider-Waite-Smith deck, are known as the Pentacles, the Wands, the Swords, and the Cups. Some other decks swap in different names and symbols for these 4 elements, such as the Pasta deck, where instead of wands we have corda, or short pasta, and instead of swords we have lunga, or long pasta. But across decks, the idea is still the same. Each minor arcana suit is associated with an element, those elements being earth, water, air, and fire. For the most part, readers associate the suit of wands with the element of fire and the suit of swords with the element of air. However, Some readers reverse these, and they associate fire with swords and air with wands. I'm in the former category, and you'll find that most readers and deck artists are. Just to keep in mind that some people flip flop these. The other two, pentacles and cups, pentacles are associated with the element of earth, and cups are associated with the element of water. I always remember that because what goes in a cup? Water. Water goes in a cup. Each of the four elements speaks to an area of your life. The swords, or the element of air, speaks to mental acuity and logic and knowledge and all things that are factual and cerebral. It can also speak to communication. If you're well versed in astrology, keep in mind that the same elements that we divide zodiac signs into are the elements that we divide minor arcana suits into. If you think of the traits associated with the air signs, Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius, those are also the traits associated with the suit of swords. The cups are water, and water is emotions. It's empathy and compassion and the depths of your feelings. It can also be creativity, although keep in mind that creativity comes in many forms. Sometimes it's very cerebral and we can see creative processes showing up in the swords, and other times it's pouring your heart onto a notebook page, and that's when it's expressing itself as more of a cups. When you think of the cups, think of the water signs, Pisces, Cancer, and Scorpio, and what the traits associated with them are. They're flowy, they're wishy-washy, they are not always super duper logical, but they always know how they feel, and they always feel it so strongly and so deeply, and really bring the human element. Then we've got the wands, which are fire, so think of things like passion and creativity and action. Oh, there's that word creativity again, but think of this more as the kind of creativity of putting something out into the world. Say you've been tinkering and building a robot and you've just been really, really excited about this thing. Real Wands energy is finally unleashing your robot on the world and seeing how people react to it. It's the excitement that drives you to do creative things. Think of those motivated, go-getter, let's do it fire signs of Aries and Leo and Sagittarius. Then we've got the pentacles, and the pentacles are earth energy. Think of the element of earth and its associated signs, which are Taurus, Capricorn, and Virgo. They're the analytical ones. They're the down-to-earth ones. They're the ones who are going to tell you that your big, grand, ambitious plan probably isn't a good idea, and then show you exactly why their calculations support your big, grand plan not being a good idea. Now, I don't want to cast them as the party poopers. Think of them more as the responsible parties. They're the ones who are willing to hunker down and enjoy delayed gratification and really work hard, even if that means working slowly. Keep these four elements in mind when you interpret the Knight, as well as when you interpret any court card, or really any minor arcana card. So let's circle back to that term, court cards. The court cards are the cards that have names like Page of, Knight of, Queen of, and King of. They're part of the minor arcana, which I interpret as being a little closer to the situation that you're reading about. Here's how I interpret the two halves of the deck. I read the major arcana as being more about big, overarching themes and time periods and just things going on, while I read the minor arcana as being a bit more zoomed in and a bit more micro. So things more like the day-to-day minutia of your job and your family life and just the things you do. And within that, the court cards are the people who populate your world. So an analogy might be the major arcana is a concept like being in school. Think about what that means. It means you're a student, and it means that right now your job is to learn and to attend class and to complete exams and grading periods. It's not hyper-specific to what you do every single day, but when you say, I'm in school, we know what that means. Within this analogy, the minor arcana would be your day-to-day tasks. So one suit might be math class, another suit might be science class. And the minor arcana would really speak to, well, what am I specifically doing? Okay, I'm making a presentation for my physics class. I've been assigned The Catcher in the Rye to read for my English class. Then within that minor arcana, the court cards are the people who are doing things and the characters you encounter. So a king might be one of your teachers, or a page might be one of your classmates. It's who's specifically here. I read court cards as people and sometimes specific roles. For example, let's say you're doing a tarot pull and you pull up the Knight of Swords. I might interpret that as you're being asked to take on this Knight of Swords like role, or the knight could symbolize a person involved in the situation at hand. So let's talk about who the knights are in tarot. Knights are exuberant. Knights are motivated, they're energetic, they're the ones who go racing into battle ahead of all the rest, with their swords drawn, ready to take charge and take action. But think about this. What demographic of person is typically a knight? They're generally young men. Emphasis on the young, not quite as much the men, because in tarot, in the court cards, the gender doesn't really matter. A knight can absolutely symbolize a woman, and a woman can absolutely be called to take on the role of a knight. Let's think about the knights as young adults. Think about what life is like in your teens and your 20s. Everything is new. You might be finishing a degree, or to bring it back to your teenage years, you might be getting your first job, or having your first romantic relationship, or getting your driver's license. Kicking it out to your 20s, you might be moving into your first apartment, or you might be traveling the world by yourself for the first time. You might be entering the workforce in a much different capacity than you had as a teenager. Maybe you're using your degree. In any case, it's an era of newness and an era of firsts. It's a period of exploration and learning a lot about yourself, about the others around you, about the world you occupy. And that can come with a lot of confusion and a lot of perhaps false starts and genuine, earnest ideas that don't quite pan out, that become lessons that you'll learn and carry with you for the rest of your life. It's also an era that can set the tone for things you do later in life. Maybe you meet your long-term partner. Maybe you buy the house that you then live in for decades and decades. It's an era marked by self-discovery alongside a lack of life experience. In fact, this is where a lot of your life experience comes from. So keep that in mind when you pull a knight card, and then to interpret a knight card further, look at which suit it's part of. That's the flavor of the person we're talking about, or the role that we're talking about. Let me use an example to illustrate what I mean. Let's say we do a pull, and we pull up the Knight of Cups, since we were talking about him a bit earlier. Let's say you just got a new job, and you want to know how you're going to fit in with your new team. So we've pulled this Knight of Cups, and I would interpret that as don't make assumptions about anybody, and don't lock yourself into certain feelings or opinions about anyone on this team or your role within it, because you're being asked to come into this environment with an open mind for new emotional experiences. You're being asked to come in with an open heart and to approach this new environment as if you were just making new discoveries about how you feel and how you relate to others. I see this as a very emotionally centered role. Perhaps it's one that requires you to be empathetic to others or to do a lot of customer-facing work. And to succeed here, you're being told to embrace the role of someone who's open to discovery and perhaps open to being teachable, because knights do work under generals after all. And even if it's not a customer-facing, emotionally based role, maybe you're going into being a programmer or something where you'll be primarily working behind a desk. I think you still need to embrace those Knight of Cups traits as you enter this new work environment, and be similarly willing to explore your feelings and how your emotional state relates to how you perform at work. Because that's who the Knight of Cups is. The Knight of Cups is somebody who's either literally a teenager or young adult, or someone who feels like they're a teenager or in that young adult phase in the scenario that they're going through. We could do a poll for someone who's 65 and just re-entering the dating scene, and if they pull the Knight of Cups, I would similarly say, come into this with that teenager-like sense of wonder. be willing to get those butterflies and be willing to be dramatic and be romantic and not let past life experience keep you from trying things that might interest you or perhaps giving somebody a chance that you otherwise might not have. Compare the Knight of Cups to the Knight of Pentacles. We still have that new adult energy, but here it's channeled more toward Pentacles themes. So themes like building stability and grounding and acquiring assets. When I think of the Knight of Pentacles, I think of that kid in high school who's had a side hustle since they were 10 years old and they can't wait to get their first W-2 job because they already know which car they want and they're going to work as many hours as necessary to buy that car so they can start driving it the second they get their license. Alternatively, maybe they're an economics or business student in college who's working really hard not just at their coursework, but at things like networking and joining things like the Chamber of Commerce or hanging out at golf clubs in order to rub elbows with business leaders in their community and perhaps the kinds of people who would write letters of recommendation for them when they decide to apply to law school. I don't really get crypto bro vibes here. I get planning for the future vibes here. This is someone who's very down to earth and practical and responsible. But they're a knight. So they're still young, they're still learning, they're still having a lot of those first-time experiences, and maybe our Knight of Pentacles will do everything right to apply to law school, but then once they get there, realize that it's not what they imagined it might be. And then they might end up making a career pivot. Not because they were misinformed or uninformed or that they couldn't hack it at law school, but because being a knight and not really having a whole ton of life experience under their belt, it's still very easy for them to get an idea in their head and assume that that reality will play out exactly the way they imagined it would. And then, as they face reality, they're having the kinds of experiences that would enable them to grow into a queen or a king. So I mentioned our Knight of Pentacles isn't a crypto bro, because you know who I think is a crypto bro? The Knight of Swords. Let's take a look over at him. Being the Knight of Swords, this guy thinks he's the smartest one in the room. He's the one who's taking steps and making strides and having those first-in-his-lifetime experiences within that realm of logic and knowledge and understanding. And just take a look at him. You'll notice he's rather different from our Knights of Cups and Pentacles. He's moving at a very, very rapid pace. And that to me symbolizes someone whose mind works faster than their mouth. This guy calculates. And this guy moves at a rapid pace, so techie things like every brand new coin that hits the market or the rapid market fluctuations, they appeal to him because it's something that works out his mind and he's like, oh, I can learn this, I can understand this, I can internalize this. Even his horse is like, whoa, dude, maybe you want to slow down? But the knight says, no, charge ahead, and he's got his sword stretched out there, which we can read as symbolic of his ego and the whole identity that he's built around being a smart person. So if you pull the Knight of Swords in a reading, I might say, hey, you've got some really awesome ideas, and I think you should pursue them. But also, just be sure to understand the full spectrum of the scenario you're dealing with, because you're coming in hot, but not as hot as the Knight of Wands is coming in. Let's take a look over at that guy. The Knight of Wands is associated with fire, and take a look, he's got the red horse that's rearing up. The knight himself has got this long, fluffy feather on the back of his helmet, and then it looks like there's more streaming down his back. He's got his wand held high, and he's riding into it. This is the explosive knight. This is the one who's go, 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 let's do it, let's do it. This is the one who's the star athlete, or perhaps starts a band with his friends, and is ready to hit the road and play shows, and he's not terribly worried about what he's going to do in the long term. He's focused on pursuing what he cares about now, and making it big now. I think there's an element of showiness and fabulousness here. Maybe the Knight of Wands would be a sneakerhead. He definitely likes how he looks, and think about those fiery traits of, not only am I going to do something fabulously, I'm going to do it with flair, especially Leo. He's given me big Leo vibes. So if you pull the Knight of Wands in a tarot card reading, I might interpret that as you're being asked to go big and go bold and Don't really worry so much about the repercussions, just, shoot your shot. So we've talked about polls where you, the querent, are asked to take on the traits of whichever knight you've pulled up. But what about readings where we pull out a knight and that knight isn't you? Maybe that knight is another person involved in the situation. Because remember, the court cards are people. Naturally, sometimes they're somebody other than the querent. Let's say, for example, we did a pull and the Knight of Wands comes up. We're still dealing with this fast-paced, passionate, kind of fabulous, showy energy that's really focused on the now and the action but perhaps based on the context, this is your partner. Maybe you're doing a reading about how you can better relate to your partner, and the Knight of Wands shows up and it's describing them. And perhaps the answer that we get out of this tarot card reading is that running a mile a minute and extremely focused on pursuing their own passions and the things that drive and motivate them. Whether that's a good thing, a bad thing, or a neutral thing in your relationship depends on, well, what you need out of a relationship. Maybe the Knight of Wands is exactly who you need, and the way to best relate to them is to feed into that passion and to be their biggest supporter, because perhaps this Knight of Wands is launching something big. Maybe they've quit their 9 to 5 and they want to start a new business and they need you to be their cheerleader because they're trying new things and they're going to mess up. And when they come back from those mess ups and rebuild themselves, they're going to need you to be there supporting them. I mean, that's the story of entrepreneurship. Anyone who's ever started a small business has had to recover from missteps and misses and lulls, and that's just how it goes. Ask me how I know. Perhaps you've done a reading, let's work with the same question again, of how can I be a better partner to my partner, and we pull the Knight of Wands along with Death. I might say that this person is working through the process of getting rid of what's not serving them and moving toward that sense of rebirth and fresh start, and right now they kind of have a one-track mind about it because they have exactly one goal, and that's get to that finish line and get to that sunrise between the two pillars that are all the way in the back on the Death card. To bring it back to, well, how can I be a better partner to this person? I would still say support them and understand them, because a Death card transformation is a really big, heavy thing to be going through. So I think they just need you to understand that that's what they're undergoing. They're undergoing this transformation. Let's say instead you pulled the Knight of Wands and the King of Swords. How would we interpret that? Well, the court cards are people, and if I were to encounter this pull with a querent, I would describe the personalities of both of these court cards to them to see, all right, who's who? We've got two people here, and we're doing a reading about the relationship between two people. So which one of them is you? And if we determine that the Knight of Wands is the partner, that would mean that the King of Swords is the querent. So I might say to them, it kind of feels like you're the more mature one here, and it kind of feels like while they're all passion and all flame, you're the one who's backing things up with logic, and you're the figure-outer in this relationship. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're chronologically older, but it does mean that in this scenario, you're the more responsible and perhaps the more established one, because a king is a full-grown adult who's been there, done that, and knows what he's doing. Let's try another example, and this time let's stop picking on our Knight of Wands because we've picked on him enough. Let's say I'm an independent contractor and I recently sent a proposal to a prospective client who initially seemed interested, but now they've ghosted me. Am I ever going to hear from these people again? And I just pulled the Five of Swords and the Knight of Pentacles. I'd actually probably say yes, and here's why. I'm getting the impression that they're simply taking their time to vet every contractor who sent out a proposal, because with our Five of Swords here, we see the main character in the foreground, and he's picking up all the pieces of information, just one sword after the next, and he feels like he doesn't quite have the full picture. hence the 5. But then followed up after that, we have our Knight of Pentacles, who's, as we've discussed earlier, very interested in investing in the future and building that nest egg that's going to continue to serve him as he moves forward. So I really think that this prospective client is just taking their sweet time to figure out exactly who's the best for them moving forward, because they want a long-term relationship. This isn't a one-off project with them. They want someone who they can put on retainer and work with for a long, long time. Now you might ask, why am I casting the client as the main character in the 5 of Swords and not the querent? I made that choice because of the way the question was phrased. It positioned the client as the ones who have the ball in their court and the ones who are the doers of the action. So, with that context, that's why I read both the 5 of Swords and the Knight of Pentacles as being that client in this situation. Now, is it possible that these are actually referring to the person who had asked the question? Absolutely. And I think knowing where to assign the different roles that come up in a reading is part of your intuitive approach to reading tarot cards. As you look at the cards you've pulled and the context under which you've pulled them, you have to make that call. All right, well, how are the characters fitting together in this scenario? And what is the overall vibe here? And also, what makes sense? Have we pulled all major arcana cards? And if that's the case, how are we interpreting that? Maybe we would interpret that as there's a lot of big picture things going on here, and we're really not focused on the day-to-day. Or conversely, if we pulled all minor arcana cards, I'd say, no, this is the day-to-day. This isn't really about themes that are going to stretch over months or years for you, but rather, what are you actually grappling with today? I think the more you work with the cards, the more you'll gain that familiarity with them, and I think that's really where that idea of intuition versus rattling off textbook definitions comes into play, because that discretion of who's who and where do I find the narrative in this comes out of getting to know the cards, getting to know yourself, and getting very comfortable with your specific decks. At least that's my personal approach. And I've been told that I have a very linear, logical, analytical approach, and that's probably because of my Capricorn in just about everything. So yeah, I haven't forgotten, and if anyone out there is still trying to piece my chart together, that's a pretty big clue. And on that note, I think that finishes up our discussion of the Knights. So yeah, if you're piecing together my chart, go do that. DM it to me. The offer is still open, and you'll get a free tarot card reading if you do. Or, if not, enjoy the rest of your week. It was great chatting with you. And if you want to give me a follow on Instagram, my handle is its_OMG_tarot. Or you can catch me at my website, omgtarot.com. Alrighty, talk soon. Bye-bye.